Hi, hello, and welcome to this CTO Craft Bytes event. For those of you that don't know, CTO Craft is a community of over 2,000 CTOs, VPs of engineering, and similar technology leaders. Please join the community if you haven't already. You'll get access to a Slack channel, opportunities for coaching, mentoring circles, and events like this. My name's Dan Smith, and I'm moderating the event today. I'm a fractional consulting CTO and coach. And today our guests are Mantle, founder at Wanderful, and Ron Lichty, software engineering management consultant. They're co-authors of the book Managing the Unmanageable. So Ron, Mickey, tell us a little bit about how this book came about.
Yeah, so we should really tell you how we met, because the book came about partly through networking and co-mentoring. I had gone from 7 years at Apple to Berkeley Systems, which some of you may remember Berkeley Systems if you're old enough to remember CRTs and screensavers, because Berkeley Systems did After Dark and Flying Toasters and Fish and that genre of and packages of screensavers, and I was heading engineering for screensavers and games at Berkeley Systems. Mickey was head of all of development at Broderbund, which had titles like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego and Print Shop and Mist and Living Books and just wonderful kids and entertainment titles. I think between the two of us, we probably had more eyeballs on our software than probably anyone else heading software development at the time. And Berkeley Systems went through one of those things, and where it had imagined that it was going to grow bigger and faster than it was going to. I had the opportunity to stay, but not in the role I was in, and so I went and talked to Mickey. I got an interview with Mickey and interviewed with him, and I already had 3 offers. I took one of them, but I called Mickey up shortly afterwards and said, that was a really interesting conversation we had during our interview. How about we get together for breakfast and continue that conversation? And Mickey was up for it. Both of us had the same sort of thought about networking and connecting and about talking tech. So, Mickey, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, it's also something we've continued to this very day, although the frequency has dropped down. So,
yeah, we get together on Zoom now.
Yeah, we met over breakfast. Weeks, months, not years apart. That's for sure. And
I think every couple of months.
Yeah, and we'd share stories and problems and so forth. And at one point, I'd had this idea for a book about rules of thumb. And one day I said to Ron, who was, if he's interested in helping me co-author it. And in fact, Ron had already written a couple of books. So we joined forces and then spent a lot of time, a lot more than we actually planned, crafting the book we originally published in 2011. It was updated as 2nd edition earlier this year.
We had the idea that if we just gathered the rules of thumb and the nuggets of wisdom that we were sharing over the breakfast table every couple of months for the previous 10 years, that it would be a book. And then we thought, well, we've got years of actual experience, and there's just so little out there written for engineering managers. And we went and at one point we went looking, as we had before, and found I think 6 or 7 books in the history of programming on managing software people and teams. There's just a ton of books on project management, but almost nothing on managing the people who deliver the projects. And we thought, well, we would be doing a disservice not to actually write the chapters around those rules of thumb that we always wanted, that we wished we had when we became managers for the first time. it's a pretty it's a pretty raw time, both for us as managers and for the people who work for us, for how little training and how little input we get on being managers.
Great. So for those of you listening, then here's your opportunity to get some questions answered by these hugely experienced guys. So you should see at the bottom the ask a question button. I think it's already written in the chat as well. So please do ask your questions, and I'll do my best to pick out some and ask these guys so we can get their expertise. And also, Ron, I think you have a request about those that have read the book as well.
Yeah, if you've read the book, we'd love to know if there's a chapter or a section of the book that stands out to you as most important. And if you just type that into chat, that would be fun.
Great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll look out for those. So you write in the book that programmers are different, and managing programmers requires a different approach. What are your top tips for making a success? Maybe we've got some first-time team managers here. What should they look out for, and what should they do?
Yeah, I think we should start with how programmers are different. And Mickey and I had we spent 8 years writing the book, 10 years having breakfast before we started, and then 8 years writing the book. And we talked a lot about how programmers are different, and it's and since the book came out, we've done talks to managers, tons of managers of programmers, but also managers of electronics hardware. In the Valley, there's a big cohort of people who do both, and the people who manage hardware people and programmers came up to us afterwards and said, "What is it with these programmers? They're so different than the electronics engineers." And it just so validated the conversation we'd had, because on one side there is an engineering aspect to it. There is that very left brain thing, but on the other side, it's almost like writing a novel. When you write software, you're starting from a blank page and creating something out of thought stuff. And it's very, very, very much an art, very much a craft, as opposed to an engineering discipline. Mickey, you were
just saying, one of the things that led us to this is that, in fact, I've managed hardware and mechanical engineering teams as well as software people. And to me, it was so clear, mechanical, so straightforward, to measure how it's doing. Electronics was in much more straightforward in the physical sense of you knew where you were at if you're making something physical. Now, chips are a little bit more difficult, but still there are aspects of that. So for the software people, it's so intangible that it's challenging, and still challenging today.
And from the stand and to that exact point, from the standpoint of managing them, and come back to your question, Dan, you can when you're managing electronics engineers, when you're managing mechanical engineers, you've got physical stuff that you can do metrics on. And you do not want to do metrics on the number of lines of code that developers write, which we all learned a long time ago. Bill Gates, I think, said counting the lines of code as a measure of progress is like measuring the weight of an airplane to find out how far along it is. Not a good idea. We don't want heavier airplanes or heavier code.
So James has asked also, as well as what you should do as a manager, what should you avoid doing? Are there things that rapidly make things go wrong?
Yeah, I would start with micromanagement.
And I would start with micromanaging.
Yeah. It's anathema to software development. It's anathema to Agile. And it's anathema and it's anathema to programming, because Agile is fundamentally about creating great programming teams, creating and micromanagement's anathema to self-organization and self-management. And what we really want, the rule of thumb that has become my mantra over the last few years, that in fact we had in the book when it first came out 8 years ago in the first edition, is that software development is a team sport. And team sports, what that means is that everybody on your team, we need to create an environment in which everyone on our team can be and will be a leader from their expertise, not leading from somebody else's expertise. We don't expect the architect to be the product manager or the product manager to do the coding, but everybody should be leading, including the intern. If we don't have an intern who can contribute something to the conversation from where they're coming from what they've learned in school, from what they're learning from the projects they're doing. If we don't have an intern who can do that, we probably hired the wrong intern.
And going back to the sports analogy, occasionally there are player coaches, but they usually are not long-lived, and they're very few and far between.
Okay. So Agile was as you mentioned, the added in this second edition. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned over your career as Agile's become a more common methodology, if you want to call it methodology or mindset.
Yeah. Mindset's is actually the right word for it. A mindset supported by a whole bunch of practices that are really best practices for software development. We had dealt with, so the context for this is the second edition of Managing the Unmanageable came out over the new year, actually. And the addition to it was a new chapter that is basically, now that, if we're Agile, what do managers do? And that notion of, well, we've got self-organizing teams. And in fact, there's a ton of work for managers to do. It's just that Agile trainers typically come in and train teams. They typically do not train managers. And when and training teams, often you draw this picture and it's got developers and testers and a product owner and a scrum master maybe, but it's seldom, and it's got stakeholders and executives, and it seldom has an engineering manager in it. And so what's that role? And we had dealt with that in the first edition, kind of all the way through. But what we found was that shortly after the first edition came out, Agile really hit critical mass and rolled over into becoming the predominant method and approach and mindset to doing software development. And we were finding that there were a lot of engineering managers who were saying, well, what do I do? What's my job? Is it just an HR role? And it's so important to have a technical manager who can talk tech with all of their folks, who can support them, who can grow them, who can create the environment in which self-organization thrives, and create that environment in which great software emerges. And that's just so important. And so that's what the new chapter was about, was about, the roles. And there are some very specific things, the very few self-organizing teams want to take on the logistics and the hard work of recruiting, and very few of them want to take on dealing with, they know if they've got a problem teammate, what they want is the manager to take charge of dealing with that most of the time.
One of the other aspects that causes this problem is that when people come in and actually, a lot of coaches come in and talk to people about changing from different styles of management, from Waterfall, for example, over to Agile, and then they show pictures of an Agile team, almost never is the manager shown as part of the team or even surrounding the team. You have shareholders, stakeholders, and team members and so forth. But the manager, who is actually very important, is usually not on the diagram. Mm-hmm. So we put him on the diagram.
Yeah. It's sometimes interesting how the most important or one of the most important things just gets missed off because it's like not seen as the core, but it's, without it, it just doesn't function. Okay,
yeah.
great. I've got a couple of questions coming in then. So the first one is from, I can't see who it is here. Yes, I can. No, I can't. User 3B8E doesn't help, does it? The question's about digital transformation. So how do you manage digital transformation? And then in particular, the shift towards training your team to use a serverless architecture. So, and I guess sort of by extension, how does management of teams with architectural changes, what is the effect of the choice of architecture on the management of the team?
Well, clearly, architecture is key to any project or anything you're doing, and getting a good architect who can take and manage the technology, if you will, and the direction of it is fundamental. So, if you don't have good architecture, it's difficult.
I think there's probably something to say too about team structure and Conway's Law. And when we wrote the book first 8 years ago, and when we were writing it in the 8 years before that, we brought Conway's Law in and brought it up, and it wasn't a very common topic, and it's become common. Conway's Law says that whatever your architecture is, your team structure will reflect that, or whatever your team structure is, your architecture will reflect that. If you've got three groups building a compiler, you'll end up with a 3-pass compiler. And there's some, which is a corollary that somebody came up with, and there's another corollary that says if you change your architecture, your group structure will be an impediment to getting your architecture changed, and vice versa. If you try to change your team structure, your architecture will be an impediment to getting your team structure changed. They really parallel each other, and we as managers need to pay attention to how we structure our teams and how we structure our architecture, and recognize that those two things are really highly linked. But
going back to the real part of the question, the digital transformation. Well, digital transformation is a very big topic, much less than just about a single architecture. It's about a mindset. And so you really, if you're adopting Agile, well, you've got to make sure that it's from the top down. You've got to make sure that it's not just a bottom-up isolated thing, or you're doomed to fail. So. And
one of those ways is that the original conversation we were having around micromanagement. If the executive structure is trying to micromanage, they will block an agile transformation and a digital transformation from occurring.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Keep the questions coming in. I seem to be a bit shy audience today, so I've got another one here from Haroon. He's asking, what do you suggest for a new CTO who is tasked with managing multiple remote engineering teams? What to look for, what to avoid? I mean, I guess the answer is, right, read your book, right? It's the first step. But then after he's done that, what do you recommend?
Well, first of all, managing remote teams is never easy. Even with Zoom and other digital tools today. One of the things that I always recommend is to make sure that you get somewhere early on face-to-face contact with whoever you're managing. I've found so many times with teams around the world that once they can sit down face-to-face, whether it's over dinner or in a meeting or whatever, thereafter the communication is easier. So, especially if you're having communication problems with someone, make sure you do that.
Yeah, one of the rules of thumb that I think one of the rules of thumb that stands out that we've repeated many times is our opinion that you really can't, in software development, we really can't over communicate. I think salespeople can over communicate. I think maybe marketing people can over communicate. I don't think programming. I don't think in software development we can over communicate, and I think that's one of the things that we really got to pay attention to, with remote teams especially. it's maybe an order of magnitude harder to ensure that we've communicated enough. And remember that communication is not just talking. It's we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should use them in that ratio, or maybe as though we've got 3 ears or 4 ears and 1 mouth. We've really got to be good listeners. And I think when you take on a new role, and so that was the question about becoming a new CTO. It's really the fundamental beginning process is getting to know and have real relationships. And okay, they're remote, but and we're gonna have to do it by Zoom or Microsoft Teams or something else. But we've got to form real relationships, and that means being authentic, being willing to share our own failures and our own limitations. As well as the mission and what's the connection of each of those teams to the mission. There's a huge aspect. We wrote a whole chapter on motivation, and there's a huge aspect of motivation to what's the part that I'm going to make. What's the difference that we're trying to make, and then what's the part that I'm doing that in that making that difference, and how to. We think that the number one motivator for most engineers is making a difference in the world. Most of us became engineers because we wanted to make a difference in the world. We want to light up people's eyes with the stuff we do. Yeah.
And at the moment, I suppose it's difficult to meet people. And I get what you say there, Mickey, about it's good to form some kind of physical bond. But in the absence of that at the moment, any kind of tips on how we can get closer to people using a remote medium like Zoom or whatever?
One of the things we absolutely encourage is for whoever is a direct report of yours, make sure you have a dedicated one-on-one meeting with them periodically. Now, it doesn't have to be every week, it doesn't have to be every 2 weeks, but it shouldn't be every year. It shouldn't be every 6 months. It shouldn't be every 3 months. So pick your cadence, but that's so important to take and actually sit down and again, listen to the person, have them form the agenda if they like, if you don't want to do it. The other thing that I think is all too common in today's, even in remote meetings, is the fact that devices get in the way of communication. Okay, so if you're sitting behind your desk and you're reading your emails, you're communicating with someone you're trying to talk to, you're not really So put your phone away, sit down and focus on the person you're talking to and listen and try to respond to them. And then form things to follow up on both sides and do it. Quite frankly, managing is pretty simple if you sit down and talk to people.
Yeah, and one-on-ones are absolutely the opportunity. I'd really advocate, if not weekly, bi-weekly one-on-ones, and don't cancel them without immediately making the replacement meeting or replacement schedule for it. It's just, especially when we're remote, a remote person will take a canceled meeting as there's bad news going on. There's something terrible going on. He won't meet with me. She won't tell me what's going on. It's
yeah. But so never mind.
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking as you were saying about the communicating. I had a conversation earlier, and there's the talking, and then the listening, and then there's also the sort of the checking of the understanding, because communication's really only effective if you can be sure the person's actually understood it, because different ways of explaining it work better for different people. So.
Yeah, I'd add to that, Dan. The some of the more valuable classes. So I cut my teeth managing at Apple, and I had the opportunity. As a result of that, Apple had a fair amount of management training. My my first manager said within a week or two of my arrival, he said, "You will take one of those classes. You will take the one on managers in the law." And I went to managers in the law, and at the time it was only half a day. It's probably 2 days by now, but it was a half a day. And I came back, and my jaw had dropped, and it was like, there's all this stuff that I don't know about the legal aspects of being a manager. And I bet there's a bunch of stuff I don't know about their other stuff too. And I began looking at those classes and signing up for classes, and they're really valuable. And so coming back around, one of the classes that I took, and I took it a couple of times at probably, it was part of a couple of different classes at Apple, was reflective listening, which is exactly what you're talking about, Dan, of we as managers need to reflect back to our folks and make sure that for them, we have heard them, and that reflective listening is a technique to ensure that they feel heard, and that what we've heard is what they intended us to hear, and that's just enormously important.
Okay. So interesting point there. I mean, doing courses, reading books, and becoming a manager. How much of becoming a manager and, I mean, actually excelling as a manager, it can be gained from kind of more passive things like reading books or courses, and how much of it do you actually have to go out and do and live?
I'll give you an example. I think it was probably the second class I took at Apple was a class called situational leadership, which is still taught, and possibly many of you in our audience have taken this. Situational leadership basically says there's a range of management approaches that go from micromanagement on one end to, on the other end, basically throwing people into the deep end and seeing if they sink or swim. So my background was that all of my managers up to the point at which I became a manager had been sink or swim managers. They'd all thrown me in the deep end. As a programmer, my first manager said, "Oh, welcome to the company." I was the second person in the company, so he was the only person I was going to have anything to ask. And he said, "Welcome to the company. Your first job is you're going to translate this program. I want you to rewrite this program in a higher level language." I originally wrote it in assembly language. By the way, it's an assembly language you don't know, but it's sort of like one you do know. And a higher level language, you've never seen that before, but it's sort of like other higher level languages. And oh, by the way, I'm headed for Phoenix, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. And this is before cell phones and email, really. And oh, by the way, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm sure you'll have it done by then. And that's sink or swim management. And I thought, okay, that's how you manage. I went to situational leadership, and there's this, all classes in HR have quadrants. They've got quadrants, and it's based on how much experience as a professional person you've got, and how much experience you've got in the domain. And you've got different ways of managing based on that, of how much support you give, how much delegation you do, how much if you've got people who are really experienced with the domain and really experienced as professionals, you can throw them in the deep end; they're fine. But my first hire, he'd been hired before I arrived, actually, but he was still in college, and he arrived a month after I did. He was a kid out of college, and I'd thrown him in the deep end, and I came back and said, "Tom, I'm really sorry. I've thrown you in the deep end, and I've just come back from this class, and I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to support you. I'm going to." He just let out this huge sigh of relief, and it changed. So that class changed my management style dramatically, and particularly with that very, very rookie person on my staff.
And just to follow up on one other thought there is that, being around a capable manager and having someone to mentor you, if there is one, or to model yourself after, is key. When you don't have one, then books and other avenues such as courses and so forth are all the more important.
I think that's why managers have been so struggling with the shift to Agile. Is there have been so few role models who weren't either on the micromanaging end or on the throw us in the deep end, and who really were good delegators and who are really good supporters and who are really good enablers, and the kind of managers that managers should have been all along. There just weren't a lot of role models in good software development management, at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Question here from Thomas. I've always assigned an engineering manager to multiple teams as a management level between myself and the engineers. In your experience, is this a good practice?
So it's always so. Mickey, I'll ask you this in a minute. What's the number of programmers to a manager that's a good level? In order to do your job, in order to support them, in order to create an environment, in order to create culture, in order to do all the things that will help a team to thrive, my number is somewhere between 6 and 8 programmers to a manager.
I mean, 7 is the rule of thumb. You can get to 10, you can get to 12, but you start to fray at the edges.
Yeah, and I've managed 35. At one startup that I was leading. It's pretty frayed. It's pretty frayed. So absolutely, putting managers in place who are good leaders and not micromanagers, and good delegators and enablers and coaches and supporting their teams.
Well, it sounds like whoever asked the question has organizations under him, many teams, and so assigning an engineering manager to take in and be part of various teams and report up is good. But don't forget one of our rules of thumb, which is trust but verify. You also need to check in with the teams occasionally yourself to see how things are going.
Yeah, and managing managers is quite different from managing programmers. In the sense that when you're managing managers, you can delegate part of your work, and as a manager of programmers, if you delegate part of your work, you lose programming. Whereas the management team, so when you've got a group of managers, actually one of the things that I see going wrong too often is that they've got a staff meeting of their managers. We directors or VPs of engineering have staff meetings with our managers, but then we cancel them. And actually, what we've created is we don't have a team. We don't have a team of managers. We don't have it's a group of individuals who all report to us. And we're not leveraging the teamwork that we could be leveraging by creating that group as a team, by actually being a self-organizing team at our level, at our management level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next questions come in. So this is from Chris, I believe, here. He's asking, how does your view of Agile and motivation line up with those of Daniel Pink in Drive, etc.? Agile gives teams a level of choice and hence helps motivation.
So
Exactly.
If you look at our book, you'll find that we quote Daniel Pink quite a bit. So we've read it and we embrace it, and it was very good insight.
Yeah, Mickey came up with. Mickey was writing the chapter on was doing the original draft of the chapter on motivation, and came up with dug into people who have written about motivation. Daniel Pink was writing about it right at that time, but Mickey reached back to, and there are three people in the 1950s and 1960s who were seminal in talking about motivation. Maslow is one that almost everybody recognizes, the hierarchy of needs. What I had never thought about before was applying that to to our programming organizations. And if you think about, what we're really trying to do as managers is to take a group of people and walk them as a team up that pyramid to that self-actualization level, which is applicable to self-organizing teams. And now, any of you who've been in an organization in which there were layoffs or there were rumors of layoffs know that the second a rumor of layoffs, that team that you built up to this level suddenly plummets back down to a group of individuals, each of whom is worried about their next paycheck. And it requires rebuilding that whole pyramid, and which is incredibly painful. And so Maslow is really hopeful in thinking about that process. A second person who was really helpful about it was a guy named McGregor, who wrote about X theory and Y theory. He created the terms X theory and Y theory management. He created the term X theory management. The managers pushing down from the center of the X and telling people what to do. They're micromanagers. They're directive. They're authoritative. It's sort of the industrial revolution idea around management, which probably preceded the industrial revolution actually in groups.
Tribal.
What's that? Tribal, yeah. And then Y theory, McGregor posited that in this is the 1950s, said, we are in an information age. We need to be a totally different kind of manager. We need to be, and so he created this Y theory of management where managers are the stem of the Y, pushing up, holding up, supporting our teams who are in the upper part of the Y. Interestingly, the words that McGregor used in the 1950s and 1960s are the words that if you go look up servant leadership, which is what all of us are called on to be in Agile, those are the same words. Mm-hmm. And it took until Agile really for those to come to the fore. And still, that's the struggle that managers are going through, is that change from theory X to theory Y that we should have gone through in the 1950s and 1960s. The whole world should have gone through, given that the brilliance of McGregor in identifying it.
Yeah, it's funny how some of these theories become so much more popular and powerful years after the people created them. So. Your book's also full of, we mentioned the rules of thumb, but there's some great anecdotes in there as well. Maybe you could share a couple of those with the audience to give a flavor of them there. There's a lot of fun in the book as well as lots of serious things.
So the first rule of thumb in the book, in the section about rules of thumb, is by Andy Grove. Managers must manage. It sounds stupid in a way, but it's so important. Sometimes you just have to manage. That's what you have to do. If you got a problem, you have to manage. So it's the simplest one and the first one.
What about the most fun one?
Yeah, and then there's we didn't plan this, but Mickey and I got asked at one point, what's the most important rule of thumb in there? And I think both of us came up with always be recruiting as the most important one, and that's tough when the other choice would be something around enabling and supporting your team, but recruiting is something that we don't realize that even if we don't have a position open, we need to be recruiting. It is a role of managers that it involves networking. It involves keeping track of and staying in touch with people. All of the people who worked for us before, who we have regard for, all of the people who we've ever interviewed before, who we weren't able to hire at the time, but we have regard for. I think it really speaks to the need, the burning need that we all need to be paying attention to all the time.
And there are a lot of great new tools, over the last decade or more. LinkedIn, of course, is an invaluable tool. But believe me, just because you think you've got a lot of friends or connections on LinkedIn, it's not the end, because I've found all too often the most important things about my connections is not what's on LinkedIn. It's not what's in their resume. It's what I remember about them, what I've kept notes on. So I keep an independent database of contacts with notes on when I've contacted them, what I've done, especially people I'm trying to recruit.
As do I. I think Mickey, one of the early conversations that Mickey and I had over breakfast was that keeping in touch with our networks and holding on. Who are their kids? What do they drive? What cars do they drive? What's important to them? What are their hobbies? What do they do? What do they do when they're not working? What do they love doing when they are?
Yeah, often those kind of personal things can really kind of refresh the relationship very quickly, can't they? And make it deeper very quickly.
Yeah.
Another question that we often come across in our community is about managing your boss or managing the board or the investors. So we call managing upwards as a kind of short term. What kind of insights can you share with us on how to do that without sort of being too annoying or too brash?
So just to be clear, our book contains 2 or 3 chapters about managing specifically. One is managing down, one is managing out, and one is managing up. And we have a whole chapter dedicated to managing up because we think it's so important, especially for anyone who's really interested in their career, because the people you report to actually make the most important decision for you and your team, and all too often without your input.
Yeah, there's a rule of thumb that says the most important person in your life is the person you report to, and there's another that says that what your manager thinks. I'm not going to get this quite right, but what your manager perceives is reality. Doesn't matter whether it's reality or not. Their perceptions are reality, and it's up to us to manage those perceptions, to create those perceptions, to make sure that we're communicating communicating upward about what our teams are doing and about the accomplishments and the outcomes and the effectiveness of our teams, and affecting those perceptions in the right way.
And I might add, I forgot one other that's kind of important in that group. In addition to those 3, there's managing yourself.
Oh yeah.
Manage as well.
Yeah, we have a whole section of managing yourself.
Yeah.
And one of those things of managing yourself is moving from, and this comes to the fore as you move from manager to director to VP of engineering or CTO, of the level of proactiveness, of not being responsive or reactive, but taking enough time. This goes to managing yourself, taking enough time with yourself to be able to think through your team's needs, to think through your needs, to think through the organization's needs, to become one with with those needs and with the greater organizational thinking that allows you to be an enabler at the level that you're at.
And what about, it's quite common, or I quite commonly hear, maybe it's not that common, but I hear about it, is where the CEO is prone to go off and sell something or promise something, and then, it turns out to be really difficult or impossible to actually deliver technically. Is there some way to avoid that? If it happens, it's a problem, but is there some way to kind of avoid it happening?
Yeah, choose your companies carefully.
Yeah, and your executives carefully.
Because It clearly, like, it's not just in England, it's also over here everywhere. Many of the CEOs I work for, in fact, getting them back to reality was a big part of my job.
Yeah, I think and there's a bunch of things about Agile that I really love, but one of them is that ordered backlog. Here's the things that our team or our organization or the larger organization at a project level, here is the order of value for our company and for our customers. And CEOs who have a great idea, startup CEOs ideate at a rate that's an order of magnitude faster than we can develop. They've always got the newest, best, most important idea. And I really value product management colleagues who are effective, and it's one of the things that I try to ensure is that I've got effective product management colleagues, because it's really their role to filter those things and to order that backlog, to work with me as an engineering manager, but and maybe with other technical leaders to order that backlog, but to be the filter and the buffer between the product organization and the executive team. From that standpoint, and there's a mantra for product managers, which is, what a great idea. Let me put that on my backlog. And then, if necessary, to walk them up to that backlog. And it's more difficult now without physical walls and physical card walls, which can be very effective, but don't work in the remote world. And so we've got to have replacements for those. But to walk them up to that backlog and say, okay, so this is the most important thing. Here's the most important thing on the backlog right now. This is more important than that. Oh, well, okay, maybe not. How about this one? And figure out exactly where that thing goes, because it usually doesn't go at the top.
Yeah. And Jared's, I think, proposing this should be a new rule of thumb, that CTOs generate feature work 10 times faster than engineering can cope with it. Another question's come in about cross-cultural teams. I think it's cross-cultural, but certainly the example is managing software team from diverse backgrounds, such as Far East. So I'm guessing with the diverse, they're talking about different cultures in the team. So how can you, how can you even harness that for a positive effect, having the diversity?
So there's sort of two different ways, two different. That question could be two different questions. One is, we've got all of those people on our team locally, and most of us do, actually, or ideally should, because it enriches our teams to have that kind of diversity, and I think that, and then the second is, okay, we've got a team here, and we've got a team in China, and we've got a team in India, and we've got a team in Medellin, Colombia, and we've got a team in Eastern Europe. And each of those has their own cultures and their own holidays, by the way, which is one of the more interesting parts of everything. And what's that, Mickey? I said I still didn't hear.
And time zones.
And time zones. Oh yeah, and time zones. Mickey, do you want to? You've managed more groups around the world. I think that's a starting point. Yeah,
certainly managing teams diverse or remote teams diverse. Okay, there's so much benefit to that. You can do development 24 hours a day if you set it up right. You've got the right teams in place. So there's a lot of benefit that can come from remote teams in that way. But even there, getting them to talk and communicate and keeping track of it, you've got to have good processes in place. You've got to have tripwires. Something's going awry. There's lots of things you can do. So, but to me, that's that's the biggest benefit of diverse teams like that.
So, Mickey, you gave an example in the book about onboarding a new guy in Japan. I think it was a guy in Japan who, do you want to share?
Sure.
Where
So,
that went awry?
I have for remote teams, one of the things I would recommend, if you haven't delved into the cultural aspects of wherever you're doing work, you should do that. And there are books about the culture, there are books about the places, and understand that culture can be very critical. There are actually consulting groups that will come in and give you, for example, got to know one of these cultural consulting companies who came in and educated our company on Japan because we did so much business in Japan. And it was eye-opening what I learned. But just working with people in Japan, we hired an office, a sales guy, coming into the office one day, and he'd been with Sony for maybe 25 years. And so his first day in the office, our president of the office there and his chief sales guy who would be working with this fellow had a customer meeting. So they weren't in the office. Okay, this guy shows up and the president of the office, our Japan office, wasn't there. And he was so crushed by that, it took us, in fact, I'm not sure he ever recovered from it, quite frankly. They left 2 or 3 years later. But it took me personally so many days and hours talking to this guy to try to get him just back afloat. So a little thing like that, who would have thought it, you know?
He had come from one of the most prestigious companies in Japan, Sony, and had selected into Mickey's company,
which was a small startup, if you will, although doing well in Japan. But,
and then the president wasn't there.
Yeah. So the aspect of that, the other tip I have is if you're doing a lot of work someplace, the other thing I found was that we hired someone in Japan who'd been on the ground, had married a woman in Japan. He was from Wisconsin, by the way. And so even with our team members there who spoke quite fluent English, there were times I was never quite sure whether I understood them or they understood me in our discussions. But if I had this guy here, he'd let me know. And so if you're doing so much work, finding an expat who's on the ground there who will work for you will save you invaluable time, problems, everything. Invaluable.
So again, back to communication.
Yeah, and so I'll switch back to the diverse teams on shore, wherever your onshore is. Getting those diverse teams really is an opportunity to bring additional styles, additional wisdom. I mean, I think it goes back to self-organizing teams, and that everybody has a contribution to make from who they are, from where they're coming from. And what we need is not to freeze them out, not to say, oh, you're different than us. You know, it's a bad thing, but to say, oh, you're different from us. What does that mean for us? What is the opportunity for us to learn from that and to grow and to enrich our environment from
it cuts both ways. One of the other things that I tried to do was to get some of our guys to go work there so that we had a direct route to what's really going on, you know, as opposed to reports, you know. And so I found that invaluable as well on remote teams. And it also improved the cross-cultural communication as well across the board.
Yeah, so in terms of diversity, we're talking about cross-cultural, but what about, for example, the number of women in senior technical roles and gender diversity? What are your thoughts there? Do you think we're moving quick enough, or is there more we can do to help get more diversity and more kind of the different opinions and the power that gives?
So,
I'm not sure we'll ever move quickly enough. I think we really have to focus. We really have to focus, and we've always.
I would say that in my entire career, I never thought of gender specifically. I worked with many women. I had them report to me. I reported some. Gender was never foremost in my mind. I had a task to do, and it didn't matter what gender they were. So maybe I was an outlier, but I think that the differences really aren't as stark as you would think. Although the opportunities that are maybe there are glass ceilings that need to be shattered, and they're certainly shattered.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite, so my two favorite cultures that I've worked in, one was Apple, which tended to be much more male, but the other was Charles Schwab, the brokerage, financial brokerage, which my CIO was a woman, and she was brilliant. She was what a brilliant person, but also what a in touch person. So I began studying personally leadership before I ever became a manager, and I sort of thought I'd seen the epitome in leaders. I was at Apple between jobs. I like to say it was after Steve Jobs had left and before Steve Jobs came back. So I didn't work for the company when Steve was there, but it was Steve's culture. And I sort of thought of it as the epitome of leadership was Steve Jobs, the sort of leader as televangelist, the ability to make a product or an organization or a thought or a process swim in front of your eyes, which he did with that force field around him. And then I got to Schwab and realized that there was authentic leadership. There was inspired leadership, and I saw it in our CIO. I saw it in Chuck Schwab, our CEO, his co-president Dave Patrick, and other senior leaders, and the authenticness of those people. And Don Lepore was one, and Beth Sowie, who headed electronic brokerage, was one, and the richness in that environment. I don't know whether it had to do with the fact that they're women, but women were part of that environment, and it was a very vibrant, thriving culture.
Great. So we're in the last couple of minutes. What's going to be in the third edition? What's the final frontier? What's still unmanageable? What are you working on? What are our biggest challenges?
Well, I've switched my thoughts from management to leadership, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about leadership, which management is when you say leadership, there's still a lot of management involved, but leadership has its cut of the cloth different, and so I've especially been thinking about tools that I've used, arrows in my quiver, if you will, that help technical leaders.
Yeah, we've been talking. Actually, we've been talking long before we got the first book done about doing another one for CTOs and VPs of engineering and engineering leaders, and exploring what that might look like. So we're deep into the exploration stage.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're going to be writing another book. So we've written that down as a promise now.
All right. And remember, the last one took us 8 years.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, so thank you, Mickey. Thanks, Ron, for coming to join us and answering all of these questions and providing your insights. Your book is, I understand, available on Amazon, probably easiest, or I guess other online bookshops, and I guess probably some of the bookshops on the high street too. But
and it's digital and of course paperback as well.
Okay, yeah, so you don't want to read it.
And Addison Wesley invited us into their video studio, and we recorded 10 hours. There's the book, the second edition of the book. We recorded 10 hours of video training of managing software people and teams, live lessons that's available from Addison Wesley and from O'Reilly. If you're a Safari member of their Safari library, their Safari bookshelf, you've probably got access to both the book and the video training. but available for purchase from Addison Wesley Pearson.
Excellent. So yeah, thanks again for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the session as much as I have, and yeah, hope to keep in touch. And thanks again.
Fun talking with you, Dan.
Talk to you.
Great. Thanks. Bye.